Hello, and welcome once again to Know Before You Go, a program of the Dominican Central Province of St. Albert the Great that allows us to take a look ahead at the upcoming weekend's readings. I am Father Jim Marchionda, Provincial of the Chicago Dominicans, and I am happy to be with you again, especially as we approach this weekend, Pentecost Sunday 2019. Pentecost Sunday is the end of the Easter season celebrations. It is often referred to as the birthday of the church. It's what I've been preaching a great deal about lately, especially on Know Before You Go, because it's like the official day in which the church is handed over to the disciples, and through the disciples the church is handed over to us, a theme that I preach over and over again. We have so many reading options for this weekend, so it will be difficult to know exactly what readings you might receive. For sure, you will receive the first reading from the Acts of the Apostles, in which it says all the disciples were gathered together in the same place. And there was this loud sound and wind that came upon the room. And then they witnessed tongues as if they were fire coming down and landing on all those gathered. And they all heard then the same proclamation in their own tongue. They were from very many different regions and different cities, and yet they were able to proclaim in different languages, and they were able to understand different languages in their own tongue. It was an absolute marvelous miracle of the Holy Spirit and major teaching of what God hopes for when God gets involved in our lives through the Holy Spirit. I'll speak a little bit more about that later, but you'll all hear the first reading from the Acts of the Apostles. For the second reading, you'll have an option. It will be either St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians or St. Paul's letter to the Romans. If it's to the Corinthians, it will be another very, very familiar theme for you, saying that there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but there is only one Spirit. For me, that lesson to us in teaching is, when will we realize, no matter the difference or the distinctions of our gifts, that there is only one Spirit? And people with very different gifts from ours are still fueled and supplied and graced by the same Spirit, which causes me to say, when will we stop judging other people's spiritual gifts and realize the community of gifts to which we're invited? Or you might have St. Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 8, in which he will say, you are no longer just in the flesh. You are now in the Spirit. You are now no longer just a human being. You are a child of God. You are a son. You are a daughter. You are no longer limited, constricted by your flesh. You are now in the Spirit. I love that. There's a whole different dimension to our lives that I'm not sure we take full advantage of enough. We are not just flesh. We are spirit. We are children of God. We are heirs of God. And in that, once again, we need to keep struggling to discover that different dimension on which to live and base our lives. Never settle for just the flesh. Never settle for just the human dimension. We are so much more. So you're going to have one of those two readings, either Paul to the Corinthians or Paul to the Romans. Now, before we get to the gospel, you are then going to have a sequence. We had a sequence on Easter Sunday. A sequence is a great hymn of praise. And this one is a hymn of praise calling forth the gifts of the Holy Spirit, asking the Holy Spirit to fill us, to heal us, to refresh us, to change us, to guide us, and to fill us with joy. It's just a hymn of praise calling forth all those gifts of the Holy Spirit. You will then have a Gospel of John, either from John 20 or John 14. If it's from John 20, it will be a repetition of the gospel you heard on the second Sunday of Easter, where the disciples were locked in the upper room for fear of the Jews. And all of a sudden, the risen Lord walked right through the door, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Peace be with you." That will be the first option. Peace be with you. And then it says, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. Whose sins you hold bound, they are held bound." So in that sense, on the second Sunday of Easter, Pentecost happened almost immediately, not chronologically or liturgically the way we celebrate it all these many days later after Easter Sunday. But the gift and the teaching and the message is the same, that God's gift of the Spirit should be a gift of peace. And then we, receiving that gift of peace, are sent out just like the disciples to the same mission that Christ himself had. If not that gospel, the other option you will have is similar to what we heard on Ascension Sunday last weekend, and that is Jesus in chapter 14 of John, part of the farewell discourse, once again reassuring his disciples that he would send an advocate who would help them and who would teach them everything they should know. So everything about whatever optional readings you get this Sunday are about the coming of the Holy Spirit, the gift of the Holy Spirit, the dependence upon the Holy Spirit, and the challenge to ourselves to live not just the human dimension, but the spiritual dimension of our lives as fully as we possibly can. I want to go back to that first reading from the Acts of the Apostles. They all heard, everyone from all the different regions, no matter their language, they all understood it in their own tongue. And they were able to speak other languages that they had never spoken before. I've always said of that first reading on Pentecost Sunday that it shows when God gets involved in our world, natural differences no longer make a difference. That's what the language thing says to me in that first reading from the Acts of the Apostles. When God gets involved through the power of the Holy Spirit, natural differences no longer make a difference, and I believe should no longer be allowed to make a difference. In fact, what happened to the disciples in that first reading is that they received a universal language. They shared a universal language, not just a regional language, not just a national language, not a small, narrow language. They received from God a universal language. And in receiving that gift, they were charged with becoming more universal themselves. For me, that's the teaching. I ask and I invite you to pray with me this Sunday for a universal foundation to our faith. Not a narrow, singular foundation that we've always lived. For a universal foundation to our faith. I invite you to pray with me for a broader view of life and for a broader view of the world. I invite you to pray with me for a more global and a more universal mindset. And what I will add to that is maybe we need to pray for a more universal heart set. Not only a mindset, but a heart set. The world today needs a broader way of thinking than any time in the past that I can remember. We need the gift of the Holy Spirit today as much as ever. And not just to confirm our way of thinking. We need the Holy Spirit to shake us to our foundation, so that our foundation is not narrow, so that our foundation is not singular, so that our foundation is not one language, one tongue, one nation, one anything, but that so our foundation is truly universal. exactly what God intended in the creation of the world, and exactly what God hoped to renew in the sending of the Holy Spirit. Countless blessings to you and your loved ones on this Feast of Pentecost.